G'day and welcome to Property Australia's favourite obsession. My name's Jeremy Cownan. This is a podcast where I'll show you how the 5 drivers of real estate manifest in property price gains, allowing you to make better real estate decisions more confidently. And today's story is one that I couldn't have written the script better myself. See, it shows all our drivers at work: technology, infrastructure, population, government, and of course, credit. This is a story that is seated in technological advancements and provokes such questions as, how do I become more productive, more profitable? How do I do more with less resources, fewer inputs? And how do I do this in a sustainable way? And how does a community accept and adopt new technology? How do you change the minds of customers who have been doing things a particular way for hundreds of years? And how do I convince them that my mechanical horse is better than the horse standing outside that they've given a name to and have a relationship with? See, this is the story of a broke blacksmith that changed farming forever and became a household name worldwide. This is, of course, the amazing story of John Deere, his plough, and the mechanical horse. And here today to tell this amazing story is John Deere's corporate archivalist and historian, Neil Dahlstrom. Neil, welcome to Property Australia's favourite obsession.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Neil, you've got the envious job of being an archivalist and historian at John Deere, which means you're surrounded by all sorts of rich history, volumes and volumes of this history. And it was Mark Twain who reputably said that history never repeats, but at times it rhymes. And I often use the phrase same, but different, because history can never repeat itself exactly. Things have to change, technology advances, laws and society evolves, and governments come and go. But I wanted to ask, in your professional experience, how do you feel about the concept of history showing us the future?
It's a really intriguing question, and actually, what I see a lot is this phrase "past is prologue," and I look at it and say, yeah, that's. I mean, you can't argue that. It's just because that's how time works. You march forward, but I think there's of course lessons. Like our goal in studying history is to learn lessons. You want to figure something out. You want to be smarter than you were before you started asking questions. And I think it can help us kind of sort through the future in terms of making some sense of it. I don't think it provides a roadmap necessarily to anything that happens in the future. I think if we dig deep enough, we can start to look at personalities, and we can look at bias. We can look at what we think are clear mistakes and hope that we don't repeat those. But in terms of helping us kind of map out what the future is, I think that's a very tricky business. And you can't go into the future with blinders on.
It is one of those things that, human, like all these things around us change, but human nature doesn't.
Human nature doesn't. You go back to the pharaohs, and you go back to the kings of England, and you go back to U.S. presidents. There's always a seed of ambition. Sometimes there's childhood tragedy. There's loss. There's all these kind of commonalities. And I studied classical history, so I go back to Joseph Campbell and the hero journey, and think about things that truly inspire us and push us to be great. I don't think those things change because they're all tied to human beings. And we evolve and change, but at the very kind of core of who we are, I would question that we change a lot in a lot of areas, and we're always trying to find examples, good and bad in history, to make us feel good about ourselves.
I'd completely agree with that there's a lot of things that change, but humans haven't. They haven't changed fundamentally, have they? The way in which we act and our biases and motives, etc. It's which dooms us to continue to repeat the issues of the past in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm an eternal optimist. I believe the glass is half full. Sometimes that's difficult because we see everything That's wrong with the world. We're all very hypersensitive to it, and we see every incident of it. But by and large, I believe the world is safer than it was 100 years ago.
Mm.
I feel like the world is better. I feel like people are better than they were 100 years ago. But I think it's harder to believe it. And there's more
Mm.
reason for some people to convince us that none of those things are true.
Mm. Yeah, I would agree with that. And for me, I often get frustrated because, people tend to see history through the eyes of today's or the lens of today's and not the lens of the time. They see, for example, say an old telegraph pole and they just see the telegraph pole, but they fail to appreciate the importance of that technology of the time. The telegraph was the internet of the day, wasn't it? Produced massive productivity gains and business and employment opportunities, and in a lot of ways started a communications revolution. Yet when we look at the telegraph pole, we fail to make those connections, don't we?
Yeah, we often do. And I find myself sometimes talking about, you talk about technology and you say, okay, well, you're using a mobile phone today. So in order for you to actually understand that technology, I want to give you 100-year history of the telephone. Well, the reality is to get through your day, you don't need 100-year history of the telephone to understand how amazing a mobile phone is today.
Mm.
And I think oftentimes we try to push history in that way to say, well, you've got to understand everything up to that point. And sometimes I think that's really valuable and really true. Sometimes it's not. And oftentimes, like in my case, when you research and write, you often don't know till you get to the end whether or not it's valuable at all.
Yeah, yeah. I read recently somewhere, Neil, where someone referred to the humble tractor as the horsepower that changed the world. Do you think that's a fair assessment of the impact that the tractor had on modern society?
I think it's a fair assessment. I think it's really the foundation for a lot of things to come. Um, the horse, at the end of the day, there's limitations. You can hitch up teams of horses and you can pull implements, plows, and grain binders and corn binders, but there's going to be limitations to that. It's not really going to allow for large scale expansion, for better or for worse. And so tractors are really going to change a lot of things, from basic just increasing horsepower, doing more work with fewer inputs, but then going from towing equipment to self-propelled equipment, thinking about um, combines and cotton harvesters and other types of equipment to come. I don't think any of those things happen unless the humble tractor comes along first, and not only changes how horsepower works and how you harness horsepower, but kind of intellectually how farmers especially think about work. It's something Henry Ford talked about, and what drove him crazy as a kid growing up on the farm is he said, a farmer would um, carry a bucket up a ladder 100 times instead of laying drain pipes somewhere. And the farmer's answer was always hire more people versus coming up with a solution. And he often attributed that to kind of the drudgery of the farm and tradition. And he certainly saw horsepower as a way to change that.
The tractor itself, I mean, as you said, it created huge productivity gains. That concept of producing more with less, is the manifestation, or productivity is the manifestation of that. And for us, that's very much what this podcast is about. It's about how those productivity gains manifest into the land. And the tractor itself, I mean, created enormous productivity gains on the farm, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. And you think about so here in the United States, in the early 1900s, an average farm in the United States was feeding 2 to 3 people, and 50 years later, you're feeding 45 people from that same farm. Those are incredible gains, and the tractor is really going to facilitate a lot of that. So now your economy changes. Um, you need fewer hands on the farm, or with the same amount of hands, you're expanding your operation. And now instead of only growing food for your family and your employees to consume, now you're going to town and you're selling surplus crops. Now you're shipping food to other parts of the country. You're exporting to other markets. So it really changes the dynamics of the world economy over time.
And that productivity growth, as you said, from the tractor, it just spirals out, doesn't it? From a commercial point of view, not just the increase in food that's produced on the farm, but the way in which society and commerce then actually operates, the way in which towns spring up, and as you said, that food is moved, and then the opportunities that creates in larger commercial centres.
Yeah, absolutely. Land that you couldn't farm before, now you can farm because of the equipment that you can put to use. Now you're finding other applications for your tractor. You can use your tractor to pull a grader and pave roads. Now all of a sudden you need infrastructure because you need filling stations. One of the limitations early on from the transition from steam to gasoline is gasoline's hard to find. There aren't filling stations around the corner where you can go fuel your tractor. So you have this entire kind of infrastructure that has to be built up. A good comparison today is electric cars.
Yeah.
You can go buy an electric car, but if there isn't a charging station within 300 miles of your home, I don't feel very comfortable driving an electric car because I'm not going to get very far. So what's the infrastructure in these kind of new businesses that have to grow up around you in order to facilitate that?
How did they create those filling stations? That would have been hard from a transitional point of view, wouldn't it? From when you're transitioning from the horse to the tractor, that you need that infrastructure. I mean, how did that come about?
Yeah, well, fortunately for the tractor, a lot of this is driven by the automobile industry, which is growing exponentially at a faster pace than the farm tractor in the early 20th century. So that's very much driving a lot of that, and farmers are the recipient of that, fortunately. Um, and also you see, farmer cooperatives, and you see this what we often think, this kind of idyllic view of the farm, which is neighbors helping neighbors, cooperating. That's a real thing. It's not myth. So maybe you're pooling resources and you're fueling up and sharing that fuel. Maybe you're going in with your neighbor and buying a tractor for the first time and sharing all of those upfront expenses. Because in the early stages, it's still very experimental. You got to find mechanics to repair your tractor. You need a dealership that can support it. So all of those different pieces, it certainly took a lot, and it helps explain why the tractor isn't an overnight sensation. It doesn't go from 1,000 to 4 million on farms. It's a much slower kind of rate of growth than that.
I often, from a historical perspective, use my grandmother as an example of how she lived her life, and she was always very skeptical of new fandangled advancements. For example, she wouldn't have a microwave because, to her it was just voodooism to put, food in a box and a light go on and it go around and then go ding and all of a sudden it was hot. She couldn't come at that concept that it couldn't be bad for you, etc. How was the tractor received by the general public?
It took some time for the general public to really welcome it. It's, you think of your bell curve and you have the early adopters because they see, because this is about increasing the profit in your operation. And, it's we always have to think about that in terms, farmers aren't farming purely out of the joy of farming. This is their livelihood and their business. So it's got to make financial sense for them to make the investment in a machine. So you kind of have that piece of it, but the horse had been on the farm forever.
Mm.
It your horses had names. They were part of the family. Your kids fed the horses and cared for the horses. You bred them, so that you could kind of replenish your stock. So they had this kind of cherished position in the farm operation, and so you got to kind of overcome that in a lot of ways. The tractor is very much positioned as new tech, as a way to keep young people on the farm, things that would sound familiar to us today.
Mm.
But if you're a teenager and you're wowed by the automobile and this amazing new technology like the radio, or electricity, you're really going to be attracted to the city. So one way that manufacturers promoted the tractor was, this is new tech for your teenagers. They're really going to want to drive this and operate it because it's super cool, and that's a way to keep them on the farm. So there are lots of different tactics. Another one was just around scale and costs, comparing. A lot of ads would say, well, your horse can't work 24 hours a day.
Mm.
You've got to feed your horse. The input costs are a lot more for horses than they are for tractors.
Yeah.
Tractors are going to operate whether it's 100 degrees or 20 degrees below zero. Horses are going to need to rest, and tractors don't have to do that. So they used all sorts of tactics to kind of put it in front of people.
Which is kind of a bit ironic, isn't it? Because a tractor can work 24/7, but can the farmer sit on it for 24/7? A horse needs inputs, etc. I mean, a tractor still needs gasoline to crank it over. I mean, there's sort of the yin and yang for that sort of discussion, isn't there?
Absolutely. They conveniently left some of the details out, and there was a magazine that kind of talked about, I forget exactly the way they phrased it, but it was kind of like, this was the glorious kind of mess of the early tractor industry, which is you had the early adopters who were starting to figure out what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah.
And so this is in like the 19 teens, where they're starting to understand things like, oh, well, that's an incredibly small and lightweight tractor, but it also tipped over, or couldn't pull a plow under load, or didn't do all the things that the manufacturer said that it would do. So now you start to see legislation and regulations kind of catch up with the tractor, so that now when you printed advertising, it actually had to do the things that you said it was going to do. And that took about a decade to work some of that out. It's like a lot of emerging industries. I think of the tech industry, kind of the dot-coms of the 1990s. Of it's a period that breeds entrepreneurs, fraud, people who are out there raising money because they've designed a tractor and they need $1 million. Well, you can raise $1 million because you're going to find investors who are guaranteed a return. Problem is, you never built a tractor and you don't have plans on building one. So there was plenty of that in this early industry as well.
Yeah.
So it was tough. You couldn't send an email to your neighbor to warn them. So by the time the salesman left town and it hit everyone in town, maybe you were all victimized. There was a lot of that had to be kind of worked through as well before there was widespread adoption.
It's interesting too how you said about the legislative lag that occurred. I mean, it's very much what's, I guess, happening right now with the social media platforms. Concerns about TikTok and Facebook and Insta, etc. I mean, it's the same, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very similar. And we started by talking about how we can use the past to kind of think about the future, and that's a way to do it. To say, okay, here's some of the steps that were taken. Maybe we mirror some of those steps, and there may be additional steps, but at least we have a starting point. And I think that's a great way to kind of look back and use history.
We tend to think of history of providing a framework for our thinking. It's always going to be different, but at the underlying drivers, will be the same as we see the world. Technology, infrastructure, population, government granted licenses, and of course credit are the drivers that will always be there. It's just how they manifest will be different each time, given the circumstances and environment that they're working within.
Yeah, and it never hurts to be posed with a question or dilemma, and take a minute to pause and think, okay, is there a frame of reference for this? Is there something that I learned in school historically that I can kind of think about? I don't think there's ever harm in taking that time to do that, to see if there are some parallels, some things that we can draw from that to kind of help guide us forward. As long as we don't use it as a step-by-step outline and say, well, here's the problem in front of me. This is what happened in 1930. I'm going to follow that step by step and expect the same results, because I hate to spoil what anyone thinks, but I don't think you're going to get the same results.
Neil, can you tell us about where you live?
Sure. I live in Illinois, right in the middle of what we call the Midwest. I live in Moline, Illinois, which is where John Deere has been headquartered since 1848. And I grew up here. I'm typically surrounded by corn and soybean fields. So it's pretty common for me to see John Deere equipment driving around. We're getting ready. The corn will start to be harvested relatively soon here.
Fantastic.
So I've spent most of my life here. I spent some time on the East Coast as well, but spent most of my life here.
Because it's referred to as the farm implement capital of the world, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And that goes back 100 years, where we had manufacturers like John Deere, like International Harvester, and later Case and Case IH. We had wheel manufacturers here. Caterpillar had a factory on the Iowa side of the river. So where I live is an area called the Quad Cities. And the Quad Cities is towns on the Illinois side of the Mississippi River and the Iowa side of the Mississippi River. It's a metro area of nearly 500,000 people, which is about 3 hours west of Chicago. So geographically, that's where we're at. But I remember as a kid seeing train loads of combines as far as the eye could see, because this is very much an epicenter for farm equipment manufacturing and distribution.
So the John Deere story, I mean, it goes back a long, long way, doesn't it? You've got in 1837 a blacksmith who was dodging bankruptcy invented a plow that really changed the shape of farming in the US's Midwest. That invention of the plow had unfathomable impact on the productivity of the land, and really a huge impact on America as a whole, didn't it?
It did, and it just really came from a marriage of experience and observation. Really, John Deere was a blacksmith. He would have repaired plows. He would have fabricated, built farm implements, wagon wheels, pots and pans, all the things blacksmiths do. He moves from Vermont to Illinois, which was the frontier. It was the American frontier when he moved over the winter of 1836 and 1837 to Illinois. And it was really his expertise, his listening to farmers around him talk about the thick soil in Illinois. So you've got prairie grasses, roots grow 10 feet deep, wood moldboard plows, even cast iron moldboard plows. They couldn't break the prairie with it. So what would happen is you're plowing and you're carrying a wooden paddle or something with you, and every 5 or 10 feet, you're bending over and you're scraping the soil off your moldboard. So literally backbreaking work. And a lot of people are turning around and going home, moving back east. John Deere has this moment where he sees a broken steel sawmill blade and asks if he can take it back. He must have had that kind of aha moment of, okay, different material, steel instead of cast iron. Took it back, built that first plow, and there's a lot of different versions of the story, but at some point a customer took it and tested it and it worked. And really the innovation was two things. One was the material. The other was the actual shape of the mold board. So the soil, instead of clogging up and having to bend over and scrape it, the soil actually rolls off of the mold board. So at the end of the day, you're saving a tremendous amount of time and labor in order to till your field. And he builds from there.
As you said, that has huge productive implications for the lands, doesn't it? The amount of soil that a farmer can tend to now greatly increases.
Certainly, and it's always fascinating to see what people's habits are, and Easterners who migrated west, their tendency was, instead of trying to farm this big expansive prairie, where all I have to contend with is prairie grass, I'm going to find areas that are heavily timbered. I'm going to cut down all the timber, and I'm going to farm that, because that's what they had to do out east.
Mm-hmm.
And this helps kind of change that mentality of, okay, well, now I can break the prairie, which in a lot of ways is a lot easier than me having to clear, all of this timber.
Yeah.
In order, and so it took some time. Similar to the tractor, you got to kind of change minds. And the way you do that is by proving out a concept. And the steel plow is no different. I often tell people that, it's easy to go, okay, well, John Deere built this plow, and 10 years later, he was probably building 1 million plows a year, and he was wealthy and all this sort of thing. And the reality was that took about another 40 or 50 years.
Yeah.
For all of that to develop, because he's building a business on the frontier from scratch. And so a product's a product. If you don't have a channel, if you don't have customers, if you don't have raw materials and supplies and a skilled workforce, all things that should sound pretty familiar to us today,
yeah,
you're not going to make a go of it. And in 1860, there were over 2,000 plow manufacturers in the United States. And I challenge people to name me another one, which speaks volumes.
Oh, absolutely. And did it change, the size of farms?
Initially, it didn't change the size of farms, because that was really, well, farms are built for sustenance farmings. You're growing enough to feed your family for the most part, and maybe helping out some of those around you. But what it does do is, with successful crops year after year, to maybe add additional workers and expand slowly over time. The size of farms typically are going to be maybe 40 to 60 acres, because that's what you're buying through government programs. That's basically what's being offered up. But you're probably only actually farming 5 or 10 acres of that. The reason being is you have a short harvest window. You may have you're growing wheat, and you've got a week to bring the harvest in. So you can only harvest so much with so many people, and you're maybe harvesting an acre a day at best, with a crew of maybe 8 to 10 people. So there's kind of again, that point where you're not profitable, because you're investing so much in your inputs that you're never going to recover that with what you're growing. So there's kind of a fine line there early on.
We'll get in a moment to the impact of that technical revolution of the tractor, but I just wanted to bring up that innovation has been well seeded in John Deere as a company. It was excuse me, it was Henry Ford who was credited as inventing the modern day production line, but Deere himself was pretty inventive. Not just revolutionizing the plow, but also he manufactured plows before they were sold. Placing them up for sale, which was not something that was then done at the time, was it?
Yeah, that's right. He was. I don't think he gets enough credit for his ability to build the business. I think we often think of him as this blacksmith who built a plow and probably is traveling everywhere on foot, lugging plows over his shoulder, selling them one off. The reality is, when he moved to Moline in 1848, he sent one of his partners out east to benchmark existing factories. So they were touring mills and factories, custom design their own equipment, and build a state-of-the-art plow factory in Moline, Illinois, which, like I said, was the edge of the frontier. That's different than just erecting a small shop and building every piece of equipment one off. I think a good illustration is John Deere didn't receive his first patent until 1864. So that's 27 years after he built that first plow. And what I find fascinating about it is the patent was not for a design, it was for a process, so that they could build plows in a uniform way, that had consistent quality. So I think that speaks to kind of the way he thought, that quality comes from consistency in manufacturing process.
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? That is interesting. And it was his son, Charles Deere, that set up what was known as marketing centers, wasn't it?
That's right. They called them branch houses. And the way he went about it, and Charles was formally educated. He had an advanced business degree. The way he went about the marketing centers, the first one was set up in Kansas City, Missouri, and then he started building them along waterways and railways. So think about distributing finished goods to regional centers, but also bringing in raw materials. And what was really ingenious about these branch houses or sales branches was you would carry a John Deere plow. Well, if you're farming in Arkansas or South Dakota, you're maybe going to need a different type of plow, depending on your operation. Or you maybe need a drag harrow or hose, or eventually wagons and corn planters. So not only would you carry the John Deere line of goods, but the sales branches would contract with regional manufacturers who built products specific to that region. So now you're essentially selling these regional goods, and depending on their success, you start to actually absorb those into your operation. So we start to see these partnerships with names like Deere and Manser and Tebbets, Deere and Weber. Well, these are co-partnerships. And then over time, they become wholly owned subsidiaries, essentially, which come to be known as John Deere Plow Companies, or these sales branches. So they're very evolutionary, but at their heart, you're distributing John Deere products, and every year you're adding a little more to the line, and you're getting a little better. So quite ingenious, but it all centers around transportation. You've got to be located. And that's where you see with competitors, you start to see these hubs. Now all of a sudden there's 20 agricultural equipment manufacturers who all have a sales branch in Kansas City or in Minneapolis or in Dallas. So you start to see these hubs grow.
It is so important that the transportation, as you said, it was the John Deere company has been very strategic in the way in which it's located itself at those crossroads. Back in John Deere's day of the canals and rivers and railroads. I recorded an episode recently, episode 22, with Sal Macogliano about connecting the world, which was about the canal system. And the impact that canals have had, throughout the world, but especially America. And it's really interesting when you stop and think about, the ability to move goods up and down the river. It creates a huge productive gains, and for John Deere to be able to sell goods at those crossroads, which obviously increases the productivity of the farms, which then allows the farms to transport more goods using the same transportation routes.
Yeah, it's it's an amazing concept to me. And I mentioned being surrounded by corn and soy bean fields. Well, I'm also a 1 minute drive away from the Mississippi River, and being able to see the lock and dam system and watching barge traffic carrying all of that grain and corn down the Mississippi River. So it's incredible to see all these different pieces kind of
Mm.
come together. And it's also it's a challenge. You're taking a risk whenever you're doing something like this. Charles Deere spent 30 years of his life trying to build the Hennepin Canal, which basically runs parallel to the Mississippi and Rock Rivers here in Illinois. And by the time they got it built, it was obsolete because it was too
Mm.
shallow. It wasn't wide enough.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of risk and a lot of failure that's a part of this as well, which I think is just such a critical part of the story.
And that for us is really, what this podcast is about the changing productive nature of land, that the way in which our drivers come together and change the productive nature, the ability of the railroads crossing with the Mississippi River makes that junction a very important point. And of course, the more important it is, the more desirable, the more profitable, and the more profitable, then obviously that will be priced into its locational advantage of how much someone will pay for that piece of land. It's crucial to see how all these elements come together. And again, it's that history where it's same but different each time. I mean, now we just have different technologies. The canals, although they are still used. And railways are still used, but we have other transportation hubs and communication hubs that are the new technologies of the day, the new tractors, the new fandangled tractors to encourage young folk to hang around, I guess.
It's a moving target. I think that's what's tough is we like to look back and find those lessons, but boy, it's a moving target all the time,
Yeah.
moving ahead. And as much as people like to say they don't want change and they want things to stay the same, I think if we all given enough thought, we'd say no, the change is pretty important.
Mm.
And change represents a lot of really great things. I'm not
Mm.
saying it's all the greatest, but the fact that it's a moving target is I think what makes it so exciting, because there's always something else out there that we're not quite sure what it is.
Absolutely. I think as a species, we're wired to innovate. We're wired to change. It's how we are. Coming back to John Deere, I mean, again, I find this really interesting, that the innovation and strategic thinking from a company is really very impressive. I mean, they were well and truly involved in providing employees with affordable housing options, weren't they, to retrain or attract and retain employees?
That goes back to the early 19th century, and really it goes back further. I'm an archivist by training, so I always like to point to a document, and I can in this case. But I've heard this story so many times that Moline was largely settled by Swedes and Belgians who were attracted to the town to work for a variety of industries. But one of the longstanding stories was when the train stopped in Moline, the conductor would yell out "Johnny Deertown," and
Huh.
that's how they knew to get off the train. And so back then it was there wasn't a national currency, so you were basically being paid on barter. There was a company store, maybe it was room and board in exchange. And we know from some contemporary journals that the only time you actually saw money was if you were discharged or decided to leave. In the early 20th century, post World War I, there was a real challenge attracting employees, and one of the ways that John Deere did that was to build affordable company housing around its factories. That became really important during the Great Depression, where Deere started by reducing the rent for employees, and then in some cases just stopped collecting rent for employees who maybe weren't working at the time. And so they did what they could to just maintain a standard of living for employees, and company housing was an important part of that.
It's really interesting again, that you've got John Deere, they own the land, they collect the rent, they created the value in the housing. I mean, it was I guess a win-win-win in that it was a win that they got to attract and retain employees. The employees had somewhere to house at an affordable rate, and John Deere essentially created an asset that enabled them to do things later on. And they also were quite progressive in the fact that they encouraged people to save, didn't they? And create a nest egg for themselves.
Yeah, that's right. Deere initiated a program. They called it the Thrift Program in the early 20th century, and it was basically a campaign to convince employees to put some of their paycheck into savings accounts. And this went on for decades. This supplemented a pension plan that was put into place in the early 20th century, and this really came to the forefront during the Depression when banks were foreclosing in the United States. And local bank in Moline, where most John Deere employees had their savings, their life savings, was threatened with foreclosure. And our CEO, Charles Deere Wyman, and the board of directors raised in total more than $1 million to save the bank. And the reason they did that was they said, we've been preaching to employees for decades to save money. We've been telling them to put it into this bank. If we don't save the bank, they lose everything, and that's as much on us as anybody. And so they raised the money. Wyman himself put up half of that money, the overnight, in order to keep the bank solvent. There was an embezzlement and all sorts of things going on.
Of course there was.
Transactions. And
who would have thought? Who would have thought?
And you kind of think, okay, 1929, like these are people like on their rotary phones, patching into an operator, making phone calls, trying to, they can't wire money. So, there's a story of cash being flown in on an airplane from Chicago because they physically had to deposit the cash at the bank in order for the state auditor to approve it. And all of this is happening in 24 hours. It's pretty amazing to think about all these things that happen. But at the heart of it is, these are our employee savings. And if we don't step in, this is our responsibility to do so. And they did.
But once again, there's history kind of repeats in that, John Deere was the co-founder of the First National Bank, wasn't he? Back in the day.
He was. He was the co-founder of the first bank in Moline. He was the second mayor of Moline. He helped build the cemetery that he's actually buried in, Riverside Cemetery. So he was a plow manufacturer. He was a salesman, a businessman. He was a philanthropist. He was a politician. He did all the things that you do to support your community, and that's what it's about. Is you have a company. How are you reinvesting that in your community? When you see your employees on the street, can you look them in the eye? I think that's what it's about. And was incredibly important to John Deere. And I think he led by example. And there's a lot of examples of John Deere being a really hard guy to be around sometimes, because he was a perfectionist. He liked to do things his way. He could be kind of the absent-minded professor where he would just drop everything and go somewhere else and not tell anyone because he had an idea. So there's plenty of that as well. But from what I can tell, having studied him for 20 years, he's someone you would want to know. He's someone who would look out for you, who tried to keep everyone's best interests in mind and was always striving to do better and improve. But that connection with the bank, and then the Depression, and then that money eventually. So basically, Deere now held the ownership stake, the equity position in the bank, and eventually that became the foundations for the John Deere Foundation. So there was kind of an interesting tie-in, which is the philanthropic arm of John Deere. So that ties all the way back to the Great Depression.
So you've got absolutely making lemonade out of lemons there, haven't you? Where the local bank in the Depression is looking to go under. They come in, John Deere comes in and saves the bank, essentially owns it and runs it profitably and uses it to fund the philanthropic arm of John Deere. It's quite an interesting story, isn't it?
It's an interesting story, and it's a great example of it's great to have a plan, but sometimes it's how you respond versus what your plan is. And I think it's a great example of how do you respond, which kind of goes back to what are your values? What do you stand for? Because that's going to drive a lot of your behavior and a lot of those decisions that you have to make in real time.
I've heard that the original automobiles were often referred to as the mechanical cockroach. I kind of like that. Were tractors simply referred to as the mechanical horse, or were they referred to by some other derogatory term?
I've never heard the mechanical cockroach, but
really? Never heard the mechanical cockroach?
No, but it's my new favorite phrase. So I'm going to be sure to to use that. Yeah, the tractor was often referred to as a mechanical horse. In its basic form and function, that's exactly what it was. So I think that's an easy attribution to make.
So we were talking before about the transition from the horse to the tractor. The Luddites were famous for smashing new textile machinery in protest of progress. Did anything like that happen with the tractor?
I've never found really any indication of that sort of thing happening. But it's pretty amazing. Tractors didn't outnumber horses on American farms until the 1950s. So it was really a long transition. And so the reality is that tractors and horses work side by side for decades, because they both had their place.
Yeah.
And one of the other challenges with adoption of a tractor, and this is really something that John Deere studied quite a bit, which kind of delayed their entry into the tractor business, is okay, you're a farmer, you buy a tractor, you don't have a single implement that's compatible with that tractor. So if you're selling a tractor, you've got to design a new hitch for your grain binder, for your corn planter, for your plows. So it's different angles, it's different tolerances. All of those things have to be re-engineered and redesigned from scratch. Now you're instead of building a lot of your implements from wood, now you're building them out of steel. And in some cases they need to be heavier, in some cases they need to be lighter. So you're basically having to redesign everything you build in a short period of time. And it's an area where Henry Ford was different than the others. He said, I'm just going to kill the world with volume and I'm going to build 1 million tractors a year. He never came close to that. But he said, I'm not going to build a single implement because I know there's no money in it. So his strategy was incredibly different than a company like Deere, who said, well, we've been designing implements for 80 years.
Yeah.
That's kind of our business.
Yeah.
The tractor we're not sure about yet, but we know, having partnered with tractor manufacturers for almost 30 years, in different shapes and sizes, like they understood the engineering of redesigning their line and what that meant. And so they understood that you had to take kind of a long-term view of this and get it right in order to do all of those different things at once. So it was a different challenge than someone like Henry Ford had.
It's a really interesting point, though, isn't it? That the development of the tractor, I mean, it wasn't compatible with all those other implements. That would have been hard from a sales point of view, to convince a farmer of the benefits of the tractor, the cost of the tractor, and then the cost of having to essentially retool. Would have been a big ask.
It was a huge ask. Henry Ford started throwing in a free plow with the purchase of any tractor. And so you see all these kind of tactics and techniques in order to convince a farmer to invest in a tractor. But again, when you say the farm tractor is this fundamental shift, it is because of everything that went along with it. It's it's like I talk about, if we put a tractor on exhibit, it's amazing to see a restored tractor sitting there, but it's also incomplete if it's not got something hitched to it, or
Mm,
if it's got a cultivator
mm,
rig mounted, or something else, because otherwise it's a tractor. You can drive it, but you're not doing anything with it unless you're
mm,
pulling something or pushing something.
mm. And that's where the productivity gain comes from, isn't it? It's the movement of those implements. Um, you often talk about um, the tractor as being an innovation story. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
At its very heart, it's an innovation story, for one, because it's something that in the form of, and so, like most innovations, it doesn't just happen overnight. It's kind of this process over time. So from the tractor, you go from stationary engines, steam engines, to gasoline and kerosene powered engines, from large tractors to small tractors. So there's this evolution. But you think again about innovation is very much about these kind of this iterative process of, okay, well, this worked, this didn't work. Now we're going to use those things, and we're maybe going to develop a new machine form, something that does something that it couldn't do before. And so in the aggregate, and that's how I think about innovation, which I think is separate from invention.
Mm,
But innovation is about doing something different
mm,
and doing something that works and is successful. Again, I go back to John Deere himself, because it's there's others who were developing steel plows around the same time as John Deere. And but the big difference was John Deere built it, he sold it. Those two things have to go together, because if you build it and put it in your garage, who cares,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
How innovative is that? So you're creating a market. And then what comes next? John Deere didn't build the same steel plow for the next 20 years. Each year it was a little different. He continued to innovate, so it becomes very evolutionary in that way. And so that's how I think about the farm tractor. And really, I think that's what led to Henry Ford's eventual failure in 1928, when he exited the tractor business, which is, his approach was, I've designed the perfect tractor, much like he said he designed the perfect automobile with the Model T, and we're not making any changes. There's some minor modifications over the years, but it's very much a one size fits all approach, where his competition said, no, because every farm's different. Like, my neighbor's farm is different than my farm. If you're 2 states away, or you're a province away in Canada or wherever you are, the innovation is, how do you evolve that design? How do you make it something better than it was, so that different machines work for different people in different applications in different places?
And we're talking things like changing in topography, changing in soil types, changing in the sort of implements that are being pulled. So, whether you need a very strong heavy tractor or something's light and maneuverable. I mean, they're the sort of things that you're talking about, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. How often are you rotating? Today, are you planting cover crops? Yeah, is it hilly? Maybe your soil tends to be wetter than your neighbor, because maybe there's a creek running through the middle of your neighbor's farm. There's a lot of variations, and even on your own farm, that can change from year to year,
Mm.
depending on inputs, on weather. So these are variables that farmers deal with today, as they always have, on a regular basis. I just read this week, someone was writing about this notion of, well, farmers, in certain parts of the world, where they get the winters off.
Mm.
And the point was, okay, well, the winter's off. are spent doing a lot of the work, which is planning all of this for the upcoming year
Mm.
and dealing with all of these variables and all these inputs and changing prices and things that are often out of your control. Hopefully you're learning, from previous years, but it's ever evolving. You just can't do the same thing from one year to the next. I think farming is an incredible example of that.
I find that amazing with Henry Ford that, you've got this visionary guy who invented the Model T. He conceived the modern day production line, and yet he just didn't move with the times or didn't see the need for a tractor to fit its purpose. He just saw the production of the tractor, one size fits all. It's sort of, it's almost at odds as to what defines him.
He's such a fascinating figure, to go from someone with a very rudimentary education to developing his automobile and driving marketing. He was incredibly stubborn, but incredibly personable at the same time. He was often on the wrong side of history, just with his political views and his social views. But boy, when he thought he had something worked out, then nothing was ever going to change.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
and part of that, you're a product of your times. I also think he read his own headlines, which is a
Yeah.
problem. And you start to kind of believe what people are writing about you. But
I also,
yeah, he was a
I
polarizing figure for sure.
I find it amazing too that, he became a folk hero, worshipped by Americans, and yet he worked exclusively to eliminate the human element from most human occupations. It's kind of bizarre in some ways, isn't it?
It's incredibly bizarre, and there's so many parallels to that with his agricultural background. He had this obsession. His sister talked about this obsession from a very early age of eliminating drudgery. He used this word all the time in his autobiography, that he wanted to mechanize everything to the point of perfection where it does take the human element out of it.
Mm.
And but while he had this tendency, especially with his engineers who were designing his tractor early on, they had a blackboard where they were drawing out designs or they would tally production, and he sat in his mother's rocking chair while he was watching the state of the art, assembly line at work. So you have this juxtaposition of Henry Ford, who's driving all of this technology and eliminating drudgery and mechanizing everything, sitting in his mother's chair, because of the nostalgia and the memories, which is why he bought the family farm and goes out on camping trips with the vagabonds, and is always trying to get in touch with nature. These two sides to him, which I think are kind of inside most people.
Yeah.
But he was living it. When you're the richest man in the country, you're actually living it out, and so it's there for everyone to see. And so and actually that's a lot of my research into the tractor industry started with Henry Ford, because I kind of got drawn into his character.
Yeah.
And fascinated by this idea that the Model T got in his way, because his dream was to build a farm tractor from a very early age. He saw a steam engine at the age of 12 and was just mesmerized by it. And so
Yeah.
that was in his mind, and the Model T kind of got in his way.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's amazing how history evolves like that. So Henry Ford was very dogmatic with his approach with the farm tractor. John Deere was a little bit late to the scene, but were very cautious, and saw the implements as being, in a lot of ways, the driver of the tractor technology. How did that differ from International Harvester? How did they approach it? Because they're the other big name in this story, aren't they?
That's right. Three companies, three very different stories. International Harvester is $100 million company. They're the fourth largest company in the United States. They're the first company to create what they called a full line, which is you're building everything for the farm. And International Harvester is nearly as old as John Deere in terms of age of companies. They start by uh, trying to build an automobile, which is not uncommon for agricultural manufacturers in that period of time. That leads into the tractor. They become an early leader in the tractor industry. So they've really got a stranglehold um, over most types of machines. John Deere is a much smaller company. They're oh, when Harvesters formed in 1902, John Deere is a tenth of their size. In 1910, John Deere kicks off a reorganization and consolidation plan. They triple the size of the company. They're now a $30 million company. They consolidate those sales branches. They become wholly owned subsidiary. And some of this is driven by tax law, by the way. So context is important. Some of this is driven by, okay, well, sales branches are now being double taxed. So we're going to roll them into the organization. So we only pay those taxes once.
Yeah, gotcha.
So that's driving some of this, but Deere is trying to become a full line. Well, to do this, they borrow quite a bit of money. And they decide in 1912 to go into the harvesting business, which is International Harvester's bread and butter. That they own 85% of the domestic market, and in short time, over half of Harvester sales are going to be overseas outside of North America. So John Deere is now competing with Harvester. They borrowed a lot of money, but they decided in 1912 to start development of a tractor. And so over the next 6 years, while they're trying to figure out a way to get into the business, the industry is starting to evolve from these large tractors that are, 40, 50, 60 horsepower to these smaller machines that are maybe 16 horsepower. So Deere's really struggling figuring out what customers want. They design a single cylinder tractor, two-cylinder tractor, four-cylinder tractor. John Deere people who know the sound of a two-cylinder tractor, which was built from 1918 to 1960, are always shocked when I say, well, one of our first tractors was a four-cylinder tractor.
Yeah, right.
But what they struggled with was the industry was so small and so fragmented, and it took such an investment to design and build something and market something. They knew they weren't going to make any money for maybe a decade. And so that's a pretty heavy investment for a market that you don't know is real, and you don't even know what the market is. So they really took their time. And then, of course, they learned that Henry Ford was going into the tractor business. And if there's a sane bone in your body, which William Butterworth, Deere CEO, was incredibly sane and thoughtful. And he said, we're not going to compete with that. And if we're going to do it, it's got to be a tractor that's sold to a different segment of the industry that's not going to compete with a Fordson. And that was really the strategy going in.
It's really interesting that, isn't it? I mean, like whenever any new technology pops its head up, whether it be the telephone, electricity, internet companies, cryptocurrencies, whatever it is, there's always, it always starts with a very strong flurry of activity, and then you get the consolidation as companies start to fall and they're bought up by, the stronger participants. And this happened a lot, all over America. I mean, there was literally thousands of companies producing tractors, weren't there, in the early days?
Yeah, it went from a 6 or 7 to 8 or 9 years later, it was 150. And then a decade later, it was back to a handful. And you see these consolidate, and that doesn't even count, lots of these machinists and entrepreneurs and a lot of folks who built 1 or 2 or 3 tractors, or maybe had designs on paper. And so that's been kind of fun as I've gone through this research to go through all of these names. And we're really fortunate because the United States government started tracking some of this stuff. Early on, there weren't even industry statistics. So you don't even know what's being built by who.
Yeah.
And then you start to see the evolution of of branding, companies who are naming their machines after their horsepower. So a lot of machines will just be called a 1224 because it had 12 horsepower drawbar, basically pulling something, or 24 on the belt where you hook it up and run another machine. And then you start to see companies whose tractors are named after them. So you have a case tractor, or you have a Parrot, or you have a Hyder. These are typically the names of the founders of the company or something. And then you get into this age where you get the Bull and the Patriot and the National and all these, so there's all these kind
Sounds
of
like footy teams
stories.
or something, isn't it?
Yeah. So there's all these stories within these stories of how they're trying to position themselves within the marketplace, which is really fascinating as well. And you tend to find the same people keep popping up, the same people who have failed 9 times already, but somehow keep convincing investors to put money up because you got the new idea that you're pretty sure is going to take off. So there's plenty of that as well.
There was quite a bit of cooperation between the big three, though, weren't there? Between Fordson, International Harvester, and John Deere. They, in a lot of ways, they cooperated and colluded in many regards.
They did. There's always that behind the scenes. And Henry Ford was always very much an outsider. You had these industry organizations that would get together, and then those organizations began to consolidate. So they're looking at things like standardizing bolt patterns, for example. So you think about, okay, you have 150 manufacturers, and they're all developing their own specifications. That means every repair is a custom repair.
Yeah.
So you start to see these organizations form and consolidate. You have wagon manufacturers that start to consolidate with the automobile manufacturers. And a big victory for the tractor manufacturers is when their engineering organization consolidates with the automobile manufacturers.
Yeah.
So they consider that a major victory. So you have a lot of that going on behind the scenes. John Deere and an International Harvester in the 1920s were collaborating on tractor electrification, believe it or not. So there was some collaboration there. And think about it, they were doing the exact same thing we do today. They were going to industry conferences, they were giving joint presentations, and they were studying. And Ford was sending representatives to Moline to visit John Deere. John Deere was going to visit International Harvester. They were visiting other manufacturers. They're benchmarking. They're comparing notes. So in that respect, the world wasn't much different than it is today. We just heard less about it. And in fact, John Deere and Henry Ford were being seen together so frequently that in 1919, the local newspaper here said that Henry Ford's acquisition of John Deere was inevitable. It was going to happen any day now because the two started collaborating. John Deere was going to build plows for Henry Ford, even though we had just introduced our own tractor. So there's a lot of dynamics going on there. And that's definitely what sucked me into the story, as I kept scratching in my head saying, what the heck is happening here?
It's amazing, isn't it? Amazing.
It is.
And then you go back to the concept of all this stuff happening, and at the end of the day, it's all just manifesting in increased productivity, increased values in land prices. It's amazing that I guess that's the outcome of the story, but the backstory is so intriguing as what's happening behind the scenes.
It's so intriguing to look at that. And again, you look at things that happened, you look at things that didn't happen. And a lot of this is driven by personalities. It's built on the ability of two people to trust each other. And it's very much it feels like a card game sometime, where one side doesn't want to show their hand to the other side. And that's where we have the luxury of history, where I can look and say, okay, well, Cyrus McCormick from International Harvester, I can see his notes and on his meeting with William Butterworth at John Deere, and I can set William Butterworth's notes right next to him, and I can see in real time what
Yeah.
each of them knows, but at the time, neither of them knew what the other one knew.
New.
And that's kind of the fun of it, where we get to kind of peek in and go, oh, okay, I see what you're doing here. I also know that it didn't work, but at the time you thought it was working.
Yeah, having a crack.
Yeah, and that's what I really enjoy out of all this. And when I get questions from people, who over the years say, we have this letter from William Butterworth where he says, I'm putting a stop to all tractor development at Deere.
Yeah.
Well, if you take that sentence out of context, it just sounds like he was opposed to the tractor and let's not do it. Well, then you kind of pull back a little bit, read the rest of the letter,
Yeah.
now start looking into the context. Ford had just debuted his machine at a show. It's the first time anyone had seen it. He's trying to secure additional investment from bankers who are all telling him no. World War I is in year 2, and making assumptions that the United States is gonna enter the war at some point. So a lot of other factors. So you can't dismiss it as, well, in one sentence, in one letter out of context, he says shut down tractor, R&D.
Yeah.
You just can't do that. So that was kind of my effort here, was to pull the curtain back a little bit and start to understand the context, because that drives so much.
You mentioned the war, World War One. I mean, what impact did that have on the tractor business?
It really drove development of machine forms, and like war often does, it throws a lot of resources at research and development. It throws a lot of premature design into the field for operation. So you learn a lot from failure, especially during the war, where it has to be successful. You also see things that impact the industry for years to come. The track type tractor, which was mostly adopted for war application. In the United States, there's really no domestic supply for track type tractors. These are used often out west for kind of boggy land, softer land. We see track type tractors all the time now. But a lot of those were 100% used, shipped to Western Europe for war use. And so when the war ends, there's no domestic market, and a lot of those companies go bankrupt, they consolidate. And so wheeled tractors, which still have domestic presence, really grow at a faster rate than those track type tractors. So you see a lot of that. You saw in the UK that all their domestic tractor production is reallocated for wartime production. So now they're importing American tractors. So there's a kind of a new competition for American tractors in the UK, and that's actually how Henry Ford enters the tractor business, is through government contracts with the English. So it really drives a lot of the timeline, the machine forms, and the consolidation and existence or future non-existence of a lot of these companies.
What about the impact it had on production capabilities? And I don't just mean that in terms of production of the tractors, but also the production of within the farm environment, because you would have had the increased loss of labour for those going to fight the war. So how did that sort of pan out? Did that help with the adaptation of some of the mechanical advancements, or adaptation of those advancements to the farm?
It did accelerate the adoption. You certainly had a labor shortage. You also had a horse shortage. So that's the other piece of this. Your battle with the horse to replace the horse. Well, the United States is shipping millions of horses overseas to support the war effort every year as well, even before the end of the war. So that it certainly accelerates on-farm adoption, because in most cases you had to. And then again, where things really come to a head is when all of those folks return home. Most of those horses did not come back, but a lot of people who did come back from the war, instead of returning to rural America, 1920 was the first year there there were more people in American cities than on the farm, or at least in rural areas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when they returned from the war, many of them did not return to the farm. So you see this really seismic change in demographics in the United States. So certainly, war accelerates a lot of things, and it
Yeah.
certainly accelerated adoption of the tractor.
What about the role of women on the farm? Did that, with the labour shortage through the war, did that become more prominent?
It did. It's yet another case of women stepping up.
Mm.
And on the American farm, I mean, women had always worked on the farm. They'd always had roles on the farm. And again, we can kind of fall into gender stereotypes of, well, women were baking and feeding, the farm
Yeah.
labor. And of course there was plenty of that. But you start to see, even before the war, for example, small stationary engines, which were driving, you could use a small gasoline powered, like a 1.5 horsepower, 3 horsepower engine to power a corn sheller or a washing machine, or an irrigation pump. And a lot of that technology was often targeted as women. That now you can build an entirely separate business from your husband who's out in the field growing corn or wheat or beans or rice or whatever. But during the war, all across the world, women certainly stepped up to fill those voids. There wasn't so much women working in factories in a manufacturing capacity. That really happened in World War II. But
Yeah.
they stepped up in so many other ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I find that we probably haven't really maybe touched on that enough, that most of the discussion has been around the movement from the horse to the tractor and the implements behind the tractor. But as you said, you take a wheel off, put a drive belt on, and all of a sudden you can power all sorts of other pieces of machinery. That in itself has huge implications from a farm setting, doesn't it?
It does. It's hard to understate the changes that were taking place. I mean, you could electrify your house,
Mm.
running from the belt of your tractor. There's so many things that you can do. It doesn't mean that it's economical to do it
Yep.
necessarily. In some cases it is, but the technology starts to become more reliable.
Yeah.
And now it's a possibility where it wasn't a possibility before. Now, instead of your entire life resolving around a town center in a relatively small geographic area, now you're mobile with your automobile. Now you can grow more. You're selling eggs or milk, cream. You're taking it into town because now you can take your automobile to town, or your farm wagon pulled by a tractor or whatever. So you become more mobile, you're more productive, your income starts to grow. All of those things on a large scale do an awful lot.
Huge. Uh, Innovation has been a centerpiece of this discussion, starting obviously with the plow and the broad range of farm implements that John Deere produced, but there's many other innovations that that they've been involved with. Even they got involved in the bicycle fad of the 1890s, didn't they?
That's right. John Deere came out with it. Well, and actually this was driven by one of the sales branches in Minneapolis who caught on to the bicycle trend and started manufacturing bicycles in the 1890s. I think they were built in Chicago. And their one model was called the Deere Roadster, for example.
What a cool name.
Yeah, and these are bicycles. They had wooden rims, and but they very much, they look like a bicycle that you would buy today. It's amazing that the general form has not changed a whole lot. That was one of 2 times that John Deere entered the bicycle business. The other time was in the 1970s, where there was another major bicycle craze around the world.
That 1890s bicycle craze, I find that really interesting. I read an article that in Melbourne, in the main drag, Collins Street, I can't remember the name of the building, and it was on the third or the fifth floor or something, that they actually had what they called a cyclotarium. And I've never heard that word before, where people would apparently go to this, basically go to this place, this massive room where they would hire bikes and ride them around on the, whatever it was, the third or the fifth floor of this building, and drink cups of tea and have cucumber sandwiches. It was a cyclotarium. I've never heard that word before. Have you come across that?
I've not come across that, but it just proves that people will do anything for a little entertainment.
Oh, isn't that the truth?
But
And
it's hard to. A bicycle is a technology. It's transportation. And if it's something you've never seen before, you're going to be drawn to that. And I think that's what's so cool about it. I talk about that with, well, I can put an old walking plow on exhibit, and to most people, you're going to go, oh, that's an old piece of farm equipment. But you've got to put yourself in the shoes of someone who had never seen that before.
Yeah.
And said, oh my goodness, like I remember as a kid farming with a wood moldboard walking plow that I hated.
Mm-hmm.
This makes my life so much easier. Like this is the great, you gotta transport yourself to that time. And kind of remember that and go, yeah, the reason this sold and this was a big deal is because it was future tech, and it was the latest and greatest, and it was going to change your life.
It's amazing. It's amazing how quickly we lose that perspective, because now, I mean, the technology on the John Deere, farm equipment, it's space age, isn't it? It's unbelievable what's in these machines now.
They're so smart. They're so durable. It's just really incredible to see. I always think about an article in Fortune magazine in 1966 that said that there was more technology on Midwestern farms than there was in our effort to go to the moon. And they were talking about tech and John Deere tractors in the 1960s.
Wow.
And so we were soon after experimenting with remote controlled tractors. And Henry Dreyfuss, who was an industrial designer who worked with Deere for decades, gave a speech in the 60s talking about an age where you would have a handheld device that would help you control some of the movements of the machines, and you could just wave your hand in front of an instrument control, and it would control the machine. And so it's pretty incredible to think about those things. We had the first director of what was called the soil culture department at Deere. He started in 1912, so he went around collecting soil samples and studying farms, and he ran the experimental farms at Deere. And he wrote an article about what the farm of the future would look like in 1940.
Yeah. Okay.
And he talked about how tractors would be run by batteries instead of electric, or instead of gasoline engines. This is 4 years before John Deere even introduced a tractor, by the way, and he's already talking about the next generation of tractor. He talked about how harvesting equipment would have moisture sensors on them, and that some of this equipment would be run by solar power. So all these very futuristic, and I think that's one of the cool, I think it's something that we don't connect to the farm often, which is the farm. The farm is about what's next. It always has been. It's rooted in tradition, but that tradition is always about what's next. And so a lot of these people, when you dig into it, there's a lot of futurists in the ag business. And I think that's just incredibly cool.
Well, it's amazing to think that self-driving cars are still a concept, but farmers have been letting their tractors drive themselves for, over a decade.
Yeah, that's right. It's often overlooked because most people don't see it on a daily basis, and we know what we see, and but it's been out there. It's been under development for a long time. It's been in operation for a long time.
Can you tell me about the earliest developments? Because John Deere was very quick to adapt, GPS and auto steer, weren't they? Can you tell us a bit about the history of that?
Yeah, they were. That really came about for John Deere in the early 1990s. And again, this is the and it's very similar to the tractor in the early 20th century. Is you can imagine kind of doing this survey of, well, what does the future look like? Because at some point you make decisions and say, well, we're gonna develop this, but we're not going to develop this.
Yeah.
And if we're going to develop something like what they ended up calling creating a group called the Precision Farming Group in 1993, and you say, okay, well, we think GPS, we think satellites are the future, and you can go back to government satellites and remote sensing and work that's been done over the past, and Deere had worked with universities and with NASA and different organizations. So again, these things kind of simmer over time. But in 1993, it was okay. We're creating the Precision Farming Group because we think that the future is in this area. Well, then how do we do it?
Yeah.
Do you go buy technology? Do you develop the technology yourself? Do you partner? Is it a combination of all of the above, which it often is? But John Deere went into that business and solved a very real problem of basically signal correction on satellites, because a problem is they're not self-correcting at that time.
Right. Yes.
And so you go in and you solve this very real problem. Now all of a sudden you've got something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, like making that connection to John Deere, I think is not natural for a lot of people, because you think it's a government organization or some tech company that's kind of driving that. But then you kind of go from there and you continue to build and evolve. And when I see moisture sensors on combines in the 1990s, I think of Dr. Warren E. Taylor in 1914 talking about the farm of the future and how combines will have moisture sensors in 1940.
It's just amazing to think, like, we see the technology of today and we just accept that as the standard, but the evolution is huge. When you think about, we've discussed today from the advent of a single plow by John Deere all the way through now to, very technologically advanced tractors. I mean, you kind of forget about the history and you forget about the impact that history has had, or the development has had, on the productive nature of humans and the productive nature of the land itself. But it is absolutely profound, isn't it? It's had unbelievable impact upon, our lives and society and commerce and the economy.
It has. It's incredibly profound. I think what's different, and I'm certainly not an expert in this area, but my observation is I think the cycles are shorter than they used to be. Adoption's a lot faster, and I'm sure for many reasons, but I think the cycles are smaller. Because studying John Deere history for as long as I have, you can kind of look and say, okay, well, there's these kind of eras where really important things happen. And then you kind of build on that for the next 40 or 50 years. But then over time, 40 or 50 years becomes 30 years, and then 20 years and 10 years before you have to reinvent yourself and you need to do the next thing. So I think those cycles are getting shorter. And that doesn't mean that that's always going to be that way, but that seems to be the trend over the last few decades, at least.
And when you think about it, I mean, it does make sense in a lot of ways. Those S curves need to be shortened because, back 100 or 150 years ago, it took time to manufacture and distribute the products, to ship it up and down the Mississippi River, etc. Whereas now, with the transportation and adaptation and communications, things are always going to happen much quicker. The time that it would have taken a salesperson to go through the different towns and communicate, and for those farmers to first see the technology or hear of the technology, see and touch and etc. Whereas now there's just so much information, it just flows so quickly that decisions are much easier made. And as I said, the products themselves can be manufactured and shipped much quicker.
Yeah, it took John Deere 6 weeks to move from Vermont to Illinois in 1836. It took 6 weeks to get there. And
I think it takes my 17-year-old son 6 weeks to clean his room.
My son's 11 and he hasn't cleaned it yet, so you're ahead of me. But I mean, the fact that we're halfway around the world, we're talking to each other in real time.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm easily impressed, but that's incredibly impressive.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree. When we're talking before about the war efforts, speeding up the adaptation of technology. I didn't make the point then, but I was going to. But what's happened in the last couple of years with the virus, the coronavirus, and the adaptation and just the expectation of the use of communication systems like Zoom and Teams and etc. I mean, it's just amazing, isn't it? It's just really, again, it's just accelerated the adaptation and acceptance of technological advancements.
Yeah, it's incredible. I often try to put things in context of who I've known in my life. And I talk about the origins of the tractor industry in the early 20th century, and you look at World War I, and my great-grandfather was alive.
Yeah.
And that's someone who I've met in my life. And so when you put it in that context, it doesn't feel so far removed. Now, I was young and didn't have memories of ever having those conversations, but we were alive at the same time, and I think that's pretty incredible.
Yeah. Do you find it ironic that the name John Deere is synonymous with tractors, and yet the man who the company was named after never actually saw a tractor?
It's incredibly ironic. I think he had visions of one. He partnered with a steam engine manufacturer in the 1850s, believe it or not, and actually designed a plow that was run behind the steam engine at the Illinois State Fair in 1858. And John Deere came back and said, I can see a day where I can see these pulling an 8 or 10 or 12 bottom plow, roaming the prairies. And he also said, I'm going to build one in the next year. And that was the last time he ever talked on the subject. So I think he found out it was more than he bargained for. But he died in 1886. The first, what's typically attributed as the first successful gasoline tractor built by John Freilich in Iowa was in 1892. So John Deere missed it by 6 years.
Yeah.
So he would have saw something that looked like that resembled that in some form. But John Deere's first production tractor rolled out in 1918. So he was far removed. And our second CEO, Charles Deere, never saw a John Deere farm tractor. But in the last year of his life, he was building a Deere branded car, believe it or not, an automobile.
That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
So he would have understood.
Makes you stop and think, what are we going to be doing in 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 years from now? I mean, the advancements are just, as we said, just so rapid and so amazing. The input that it's had, or the productivity gains, and you just wonder what they are going to be and where they're going to come from. As you said, I'm very much like yourself. I'm very much a glass half full. I see the tremendous, lift in living standards that technology and advancement brings. Not to say that everything's good. You're always going to have some yin and yang. Unfortunately, that's part of life. But I can't help but be completely optimistic for the future, both from a living standard and from an investment point of view, that things will only get better, and our lives will become easier and more enjoyable.
I agree. I think it's about increasing those standards at all time, and kind of increasing equity. And I think we need to increase equity kind of at a disproportionate rate, for the better,
Mm.
to kind of bring more of that to the world. And as I very much am one who I study history because I find inspiration in it, and it connects me to people who are trying to do the right thing, and do the next great thing. And so I find a lot of inspiration in that, and I hope people can use history. Nostalgia is incredibly important,
Mm.
but also I think history can drive us to action. It can give us perspective and insights that maybe we wouldn't get, in other areas, and I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Neil, what a fantastic discussion today. What have we missed? Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
We've probably got another 100 years to cover, but um, yeah, I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I've really enjoyed the conversation. And as you can tell, I'm really excited about all of this, and enjoy talking about it, and appreciate your very thoughtful questions, and kind of pursuing these adjacencies, which I think are great.
Yeah, well, from our point of view, that's, what we take out of this story. PAFO, as I said, it's all about property. It's about real estate. It's about the land, the value of land, and that's very much driven, the value that a piece of land has is very much driven by its productive nature. And this is, as you said right from the start, it's a productivity story. The tractor is all about creating, more from less, less inputs, more outputs, less man hours, less costs. And that is always just going to manifest in, productivity gains, and productivity drives profitability, and profitability will always be used to bid up the price of the lands with the most desirable locations. That's that's how it works. And I use the example a lot, if I was to offer you 100 acres of lush green pastures or barren dirt to farm, which would you choose? And clearly you're going to take the green pastures, because you can grow more stuff. And maybe today, if we ask nicely, we might get a tractor from Neil to grow even more stuff on our lush green pastures. And that's, again, just increase productivity, increase profitability. Means that, of course, that land's going to be worth a lot more. And it doesn't matter whether that land, whether we're talking about farmlands, or because the same thing happens in residential and commercial real estate. It's all about the locational value of the land. What is most desirable. And as soon as I saw your work, Neil, it really dawned on me, like, the productive nature of the tractor and what it's done to agriculture from a productive point of view. It is just, it's just mind-boggling, and it explains a lot of the drive of why agricultural land has increased so much in value. From where it was 100 or 200 years ago. As you said, 150 or 200 years ago. Well, sorry, you said about 100 years ago, you had three people. A farm would feed, 3 people, whereas, now, it's 170 or so for the average farm. The productivity gains are just huge, and the John Deere story of innovation is just. It's just so fascinating. I think that throughout its entire history, from the plow, to, as we said, the way in which the John Deere manufactured the plows, to the marketing centres, all the way through to the tractor, and the technology that sits in the current, the current state of the art farm equipment, GPS, soil sampling, etc. It's just a story of innovation, and that's what this podcast is all about. And I find it amazing too, within the story of John Deere, about how He's such a visionary, isn't he? He creates employment opportunities, and that, of course, again, driven from the tractor, and the productivity increases the skilled work that we undertake, and the implications that has on society is just enormous, as well as the increase of food abundance and our ability to move that food. When we think about the infrastructure in the story, we get better roads, bigger silos, huge ports now that facilitate the movement of grains and other crops, as well as the automation of, flour mills and the like. We've talked on and on about the technological advancement. This is just an amazing story. And even when you think about the government's role in this story, it's the government licenses that stand behind the patents, that protect, the intellectual advancements or intellectual property that has been created, as well as, of course, the value of the land, via government title that it manifests into, and all this stuff is just sold on credit. It's our 5 drivers, technology, population, infrastructure, government, and credit. It's all the way through the story, and I just find it so amazing, and that whole point of the strategic thinking of John Deere to the placement of their manufacturing plants on those transportation crossroads. Again, don't think I could have written the story any better if I was, looking to make up a story. It's quite phenomenal, isn't it, Neil? It's I find it just absolutely fascinating.
It's incredible to first of all, for me to be part of something that's 184 years in the making. That's an incredibly long amount of time, and I think when you approach something from the perspective that you're going to be here to actually see it come to fruition, and to experience the outcomes, it's a different perspective than if you're just working towards the next quarter.
Yeah,
and I think we don't always think in those terms. But I have the luxury of thinking about 184 years of history and thinking in those terms, and I think it's a pretty spectacular view.
It's such an important story, and I thank you for sharing it with us. But tell us, you've got a book coming out, Neil, that is an absolute ripper, and I would definitely encourage people to look it up and grab a copy. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about this?
The book's called Tractor Wars: John Deere, Henry Ford, International Harvester, and the Birth of Modern Agriculture. It comes out in January of 2022, and it very much is the origin story of the farm tractor from the perspective of those 3 companies, those 3 manufacturers. It's battle for the farm. It's battle against the horse. Competing against entrepreneurs and fraudsters, with the automobile, with within the context of World War I and the ag depression of the early 1920s. So really, it is trying to draw the curtain back on, at the end of the day, how did the farm tractor come to be? Why did it come to be? And why do we know these companies and the people behind these companies?
I must say, I've had a little bit of a sneak look at it. Thank you very much. And I found it a terrific read and very, very interesting. So can we pre-order, or how do we get hold of a copy, Neil?
You can pre-order online on Amazon, any online retailers, my publisher, Ben Bella Books, and you can go to my website, neildahlstrom.com, to learn more.
Beautiful. Where else is that the best place to get hold of you on your website, Neil?
It is. Yep. There's a contact form there. Send me a note. Let me know if you have questions or thoughts, or it's just something on your mind about John Deere that you want to ask about.
There's some really interesting stuff there. It's a big topic, and I'm sure there's plenty of people out there listening that have got a bit of an affinity or a story with the green and yellow tractor. It is amazing how far it's permeated. I mean, I'm, as you said, the other side of the world, sitting here in Adelaide, and yet there's a John Deere retailer. I'm in the middle of a populous, million plus person city, and it's about 31 kilometres from where I sit. There's a John Deere outlet selling all sorts of farm machinery. So it's amazing how how big the company is, and how far it has actually permeated. So look, Neil, thank you very much once again. I've really appreciated and enjoyed the conversation. And I would agree, certainly, encourage people to look you up at your website. I'll put your contact details, of course, in the show notes. If you want to catch up with us, then stop by at patho.com.au. Patho, of course, is the acronym for Property Australia's favourite obsession. Or you can look at us up on social media with our handle PAFOPod. So PAFOPOD. We are, of course, on Facebook, Insta, and now on Twitter. I've really enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you have as well. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave us a rating or review. And, of course, tell all your friends about it. I've been your host, and you've been listening to Property, Australia's favourite obsession. And until next time, Neil, let's keep obsessing about property.
Any opinions or recommendations expressed should be considered general in nature, as they do not consider your personal objectives or financial circumstances. You should therefore consider these matters yourself before deciding whether the advice is appropriate to you and if you should act upon it. Should advice be sought, please seek an appropriately qualified advisor. Investing may not be appropriate for everyone, as there is inherent risk and the possibility of loss when investing in financial assets, just as there is the possibility of profits. While useful for identifying patterns, history and past performance do not guarantee future performance. Calvin Flack has a commercial relationship with guests appearing on this production.